So today we're gonna go through the 8 lessons that I learned reading Stephen King's On Writing. He calls it a memoir of the craft, so it's basically half memoir of his life and half a manual on writing. And yeah, I read this book and I think there are 8 main lessons that I can take and apply to my own writing, and hopefully will be interested also for you and your own writing journey. I've got my notes over here on my phone. The first lesson is definitely on adverbs. So Stephen King, being quite dramatic, he says,
I believe the road to hell is paved with adverbs, and I will shout it from the rooftops.
He thinks adverbs are basically what scared writers use to make their points. Writers who are not that confident about the point that they want to make may turn to adverbs for support, but actually they are not our helpers, they are not our friends. I'm currently editing my book and I went through it with this thought in mind, and it is true that in the first draft I used a lot of adverbs to kind of get my point across, but it was mainly not to stop my writing and kind of to let it flow. But on the second drafts I am removing pretty much 95% of all the adverbs that I put there. The second is the she said, he said. So he's also saying that a lot of time writers would say that, she said boldly or he said hesitantly, and kind of put in a qualitative adjective to describe how a line is delivered. But Stephen King says that if a scene is set well enough, if the writer has been drawn close enough into the scene, then the reader can imagine how a line is delivered and there is no need to add this. So again, I am guilty of doing this pretty much all the time. Again, I think it's something that I use in my first draft when I'm in the flow of writing and I don't want to stop, and it's easier for me to just put this stuff in. But now that I'm going through it, again, I am removing, I would say 90% of this, because I can totally understand why they are completely unnecessary to the reader. Some of them are quite obvious how the line was delivered by a character, and so there is no need for this. The third point is something that I think is very encouraging, and is the permission to use the vocabulary that you have. This means that we shouldn't pretend to use words that we're not comfortable with. We should use, of course, the vocabulary that is appropriate for the topic. So, if you have an academic speaking, you would expect a different type of vocabulary than if you have, a factory worker. But that being said, it's most important for writers to be comfortable with the vocabulary that you have, and it's not that a rich educated vocabulary would necessarily make a better novel than something that is written with simpler words. That is not what makes or breaks a novel. So thanks to Stephen King for this encouraging message. The fourth one is themes and symbolism. So he says that the first draft of a novel shouldn't be written with these ideas in mind. Themes and symbolism is something that may appear once a novel is written, and then of course the author should go back and try to extract and highlight this more. And he gave the example of Misery. So when he first wrote Misery, he didn't have any symbol in mind, but then he went through it and he saw that blood, clearly if you've read it, it's quite central to the story, and he went and explored that symbol of blood. But again, it's just something that could and should come out naturally later on. It's not something that we should plan from the start, because that's not the most important thing of a book, which is obviously the plot. The fifth element is the dialogues. Now for dialogues, Stephen King is quite honest and quite brutal, in the sense that he tells us that there are some writers who are born with the gift of creating believable, good dialogues. That's unfortunately not all of us. The rest of us, the suggestion he has for us is to listen a lot, to how people speak, basically, and try to replicate that as much as possible. But unfortunately, that would seem to be a gift that only few people share. The sixth is a suggestion on drafts. So he says that the first draft should be written with the door closed. In other sense, the first draft is for the author. He says it should be written as quickly as possible. I think he mentions writing it in under 3 months. I think, if I remember that correctly, obviously Stephen King is by now a full-time author. I think if you're balancing other commitments, 9-to-5 jobs, family, kids, then it may not be that easy, but that's what he's saying. And the second draft instead should be written with the door open, and that's with the ideal reader in mind. So in that sense, everything should be understandable by the reader, and there should no longer be things that are included only for the pleasure of the writer, but then they are completely missed and unuseful for the reader. The seventh is taking a break. So I really like this, and it's the idea that between the first and the second draft you should take at least 6 weeks of break, and by the time you are rereading your novel, it should sort of read as something that someone else has written, and if you don't actually remember everything in there, it's actually for the better. And he's actually advising that after the 6-week break, when you go into rereading your novel, you should try and do it in one sitting as much as possible, sort of jotting down the main points, the main comments that you want to change, but sort of read it through to get a sense of the pace and the plot and things like that. So he says obviously it depends on the size of the novel. If your novel is 200,000 words, you may not be able to read it all in one sitting, but if it's shorter, if it's the standard kind of contemporary fiction length of 80,000 words, then it's definitely possible, and he says this will give you a better sense of the pace. And the eighth and final point is on descriptions. So he basically says that he likes to give as little description as possible for his characters, and I actually noticed that that's also something I do. I don't go into very lengthy descriptions. I don't necessarily talk about hair that much, or build, or the shape of the face, unless it's something really important, something that is important for the plot or for the novel or for specific characterization. Then I would probably repeat it throughout, but otherwise, Stephen King says he prefers to let the reader kind of think and impress on the characters the faces that they have in mind. For example, when he describes Carrie, the kind of loser in high school, everyone has an idea of what that might look like from our own experiences, so he didn't think it was necessary to actually go and describe her a lot. And the same with clothes. He apparently does not like to describe clothing at all. So definitely this is also my approach to descriptions, but it's everyone's different. So these are the 8 lessons that I took from reading On Writing by Stephen King. I think it's really interesting. It's a really useful book. I enjoyed the first 30%, which is the memoir part, as much as the rest of the book, which is more on giving you advices and tips. And I think I will apply most of them to my own writing. Definitely the idea of taking a break and then rereading the novel in one sitting is something that I will try to do now, as I'm finishing the second draft before I start the third and hopefully final draft. I will try and apply Stephen King's process. So thank you so much for watching. I will post soon a video that is more about my entire journey discovering Stephen King that I went through over the last few weeks. I have never read Stephen King before, and obviously it was a huge hole in my reading history. I don't know how that happened, but I rectified it, and I read 3 books by Stephen King and watched a show. And so check out that video if you would like. You should find it at some point here on the screen. Bye.